So let's talk, right now we've been talking in some ways, very tactically. Specific things you could do from an open source perspective, specific things that you could do with decisions around roles or reading about different opportunities out there. So let's take a step back and say, well, what are some of the frameworks and decision-making approaches that you might be able to take here? So first, if you've got a vision for yourself, that's great. Let's strategize and then execute. There's a few very specific types of frameworks that I encourage people to think about here when they're planning what they should be learning, how they should be learning, etc. The first is this concept of T-shaped people. And what you really want to do from a storytelling perspective, as well as you go through your career, from a general self-promotion perspective, is framing yourself as a T-shaped AI ML expert. What this means is there's a few skills that you need that you're generally competent in, and then one area where you're deeply, deeply specialized in. And this applies to both managers as well as technical experts. So on the technical expert side, that the body of the T, so to speak, would be things like reinforcement learning or data set design. Data set design is a really interesting one right now, in my opinion, because within the Gen AI world, actually knowing which data sets to use to train the LLMs, forget about training the LLMs, just getting the right data, getting the licensing for it, and knowing that those data sets exist. This is a role people now have. And I remember hearing the other day about Mistral specifically being lauded for the fact that they're very good at using their training data because they're building some incredible models. And so that's an example of roles that are coming up that might not even exist, or skills that might not even show up in job postings, that if you have it, people will want it. And of course, the broad expertise is still communication, it's still DevOps, it's still architecture. On the manager side, this could be getting deep in things like managing teams of PhD level researchers. This is one that I recently saw in a job posting, where if you're comfortable working with folks who have PhDs and you know how to be that translator between the PhD level researchers and the rest of the organization, you are going to be a great manager. But broad expertise is the same as before: organizational competence, communication, knowing a little bit about DevOps, MLOps, etc. So remember, the skills for that generalist piece are generally the same, and then just pick the stuff that you really, really want to go deep on. The way that you might want to do that, to decide what is that thing you go deep on, is running a regular SWOT analysis. This is another thing that I think a lot of people hear this advice, is do a SWOT analysis once a year, let's say. Think about your strengths, your weaknesses, opportunities, threats, but they don't do it. They hear it, we all agree and nod, yes, that's a good idea, and then we go off and never touch the SWOT. And so I highly recommend this as something that you do. You might even do it quarterly earlier on in your career. The thing is, how you ask these questions, I think, is really important. So it's not just like, my strengths are the things that I'm good at. That's really hard to answer. What are the things that you're proudest of? What are the things that people specifically go to you? What evidence do you have that you're good at these things within your work environment? Weaknesses, same idea. Are there things that you are specifically avoiding? And it doesn't mean you have to work on them, by the way. Oftentimes, the advice for people that have certain weaknesses is, you know what, double down on your strengths. You're good at this other stuff. Don't worry about the weaknesses. But where you might want to change that around is if they become threats, where maybe your lack of communication means, as an example, maybe that means that people struggle working with you, or they don't come to you when they have a problem. And then, of course, that's more of a threat than a weakness, right? And opportunities, look at what the world needs, what your company needs. What are the trends in the workplace? We were talking at the start of this webinar about this idea that companies are reskilling and pivoting their workforces so that everyone has AI-enabled skills. That's an example of an opportunity. Whether you're working in sales, consulting, or software engineering, if you can use that AI component, then you're going to be great. As an example here, how people might think about this, going back to the 4 job postings that we were looking at with BigCo, if you were someone like if you were maybe more, if you were doing the SWOT analysis, excuse me, and you notice that you really enjoy presenting on analytics and you really enjoy thinking on your own, coming up with cool insights, and then going off and sharing them with the world, you might notice that your strengths are more aligned with the staff data scientist role. On the flip side, you might notice that you really like collaborative problem solving with customers. You like talking to users, you like coming up with feature ideas, you like demoing your software. Then maybe you're going to be more of a lead solutions consultant and your strength goes down that path. Neither is wrong, both are great. And so this is how you might want to think about this. If you are exploring this and now starting your career, we talked a little bit about our friend Mike here. this 1 foot in, 1 foot out strategy. What you want to do is, generally the things you're exploring, you want to limit them to maybe 1 or 2 skills or things that you're learning. And then the things that you're good at, you're going to start building a bigger and bigger base. And so if you're starting off, let's say you just finished school and you've got an AI research background, maybe the first thing you're going to be learning is that software development side of things. Once you have the AI research and software development components together, maybe then you learn how to do requirements gathering, then product development, then managing people. And so what I recommend here oftentimes is have that base and work from that comfort zone in some ways, or that zone of strength, so that people know, yes, that's the person that does X really, really well. And then they'll forgive you if you make mistakes where you're learning in other areas. And Mike is a good illustration of this, because particularly if you look at these different industries, what he had at that point was a really strong base in customer analytics. The fact that he was working in real estate and maybe didn't know real estate very well was secondary. People would forgive him for the lack of real estate knowledge because he was still good at analyzing the data. The same with the CPG brand that he was working with, and now the pharma company. And you could see that even though he was learning lots of new things throughout, he was still being perceived as an expert and still progressing in his career, which is really, really powerful. In terms of how you might want to do this in your day-to-day, there's a few things to keep in mind here. So one is double loop learning. The second is the magic loop, completely unrelated loops, the grow model, and then something called good strategy, bad strategy. So I want to talk about double loop learning because it comes from a really great Harvard Business Review article that's over 30 years old now, called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. We're all, I imagine, very intelligent folks, very technical, many of us, and we often see the world in this single loop, which is we make decisions, we see what happens in the real world, we collect feedback and iterate on our understanding and our decision making. But of course, we've got a mental model that informs that decision making. And one of the things that a lot of really smart people tend to do that becomes a bit of a challenge for them later on in their careers is they make decisions, or they explain away, I'll put it this way, they explain away their mistakes. So something goes wrong and they say, well, that was inevitable, or that was not possible anyway. And it's not about them, it's about the situation, which eventually they start overlooking their weaknesses, those threats that I mentioned, etc. And so what you want to do with double loop learning is, as you collect information, inform your mental model, excuse me, and change it. I'll give you a very specific case study that comes up all the time with the companies that I work with. Technical experts saying no to projects or avoiding risk. People will say, okay, well, we need to build a new model, or we're going to train an LLM or something. And it's very easy to say, no, that's too expensive, or that's not going to work, or it's not possible. The R&D risk is just too high. And when I meet one-on-one with a lot of these technical experts, what I actually learn is, and as we have these conversations, is that they're actually afraid of failing. And so it's not that the project's too difficult. They're just worried about failing in a public way. And look, failing does suck. Not being able to deliver on a project can be really difficult. But learning, realizing that the problem wasn't truly that R&D risk or the budget or the timeline, but it was actually their own personal challenge, that's where their mental model changes. And then all of a sudden, I see them taking bigger risks. And so that's something that I would encourage you to do and to think about. It doesn't necessarily apply to risk taking. This can apply to other things. And if you're curious about challenging yourself in this way, I highly recommend reading Teaching Smart People How to Learn. The other piece, a little simpler, fortunately, is the magic loop. So the idea here is simply there's 5 steps to getting promoted. Do your job well, ask your manager how you can help, do what they ask for work that advances your career, do as they suggest. It sounds really, really simple, but it's amazing how many people don't do it. And I would say a few things to call out here. One is make sure your current job, you're doing it well. What I notice a lot of times is people will start a new role and they won't be doing their existing stuff well, but they're going to be asking or volunteering for new things and trying to move maybe a little too quickly or impatiently. And that just ends up hurting them in different ways. So really focus on doing your job well before starting to take on these bigger risks and opportunities. Some examples of how you might apply the magic loop: offer to mentor new employees, attend customer meetings. Attending customer meetings is something that I absolutely love when AI ML folks do this. And it's so rare for them to do it because oftentimes this is where you get an opportunity to explain your technology to people that might not be as familiar with it. Or this is an opportunity where you could talk about research concepts, simplify them, and also build relationships that inform your model, your actual models that you're building or the products that you're building. And I feel like this is one where not enough people take advantage of it. Supporting recruiting efforts for two reasons. One is, again, you get to meet a lot of great people, but then you'll also be on the other side of the table for once. You'll see how people pitch you, you'll see how people try to network with you, and that can inform your own networking and recruiting work and job search later. And then, of course, take on a high risk R&D task. There's a lot of these at companies. They're scary, again, because you might fail. But what's nice about high risk ones too is people might not be expecting you to succeed. So when you do actually succeed, when you work extra hard and push through, you get a lot more credit than you would otherwise. On the management side, there's a few things you might want to consider. The first and most important thing that I do want to emphasize, though, is that many employers struggle with management training. They simply don't provide it. And so what ends up happening is people learn to be managers when they get promoted to being managers. And this, by the way, have empathy for new managers for this very reason. It's so difficult because they've never done it before. They're not getting maybe the mentorship they deserve, so they're going to make mistakes. If you're reporting to someone or working with someone like that, just give them some room and support them. Um, the other piece that I would say is look for opportunities around collaborative problem solving. So one of the things that's really, really important here is, again, if you're focusing on management, you're going to be focused on facilitation. So try to bring people together, facilitate those meetings, and then explore how to influence, test hypotheses in meetings. If I'm a little more assertive at this meeting, what's going to happen? If I'm a little less assertive here, or if I'm going to push on the R&D risk in this meeting, what happens? I'm going to explain this new concept to a customer in a different way than I normally do. What happens then? These are all really great hypothesis-driven approaches to learn and develop yourself. And again, also ask to try management. I won't go through these bullet points because they're somewhat similar, but really the point here is go out and ask your managers, tell them, I'm interested in managing one day. How do I get some exposure here? And remember, of course, to keep learning. Again, we've got some great webinars from the past on this around nuances of data roles if you want to look at different opportunities. Also, getting ahead and staying ahead. Our last webinar really, really focused on upskilling and reskilling. This space, particularly AI ML right now, is changing so rapidly that you need to work on learning and keep learning. In fact, I'll give you one example of almost a negative case study here. For folks who have been in the NLP space for over a decade, I think this one will really resonate with you. 10 years ago, the world-class, state-of-the-art NLP type work was often focused on things called bag of words. Really, really simple. You literally count occurrences of text, count occurrences of tokens, and then you try to build correlations across those occurrences with sentiment or whatever else. Today, deep neural networks and transformers have completely transformed NLP. And one of the things that I see is some researchers who decided not to keep working on their technical expertise. They were doing really well on the bag of words side of things, are completely overwhelmed now. They've fallen behind, they're really struggling. And the flip side is people who are just starting their careers in some cases, who might only have 12 months of research experience, are actually building better models and outperforming those researchers. And so this is an example, I think, particularly apt right now. Things don't always change this fast, but something to be aware of and something to keep in mind, certainly. So putting all of this together, again, lots of different frameworks. You don't have to use them all. The point here is there's a few, use the magic loop to tactically plan your days and your weeks at a company. Use the double loop approach to learn and to challenge yourself. Do a SWOT analysis. When you put it all together, what I often recommend is basically using something like the GROW model, which focuses on four things: the goal, where do you want to be? The reality, where are you today? The obstacles, and then just do it. So suppose that you are you want to work in AI product management and you haven't really had the opportunity to do so because your reality is that you've been working in ML ops and you've been doing back-end work. Well, the obstacles are pretty clear, right? You need to speak to the product team. They need to build trust, and you need to build trust with them. You need to start thinking about how do product features get proposed. So these are all things that you can do. And, it's as simple as challenging yourself and say, well, can I speak to the product team this week or this month or tomorrow? Why not, right? The other piece that I think about a lot here is good strategy, bad strategy. Similar type of idea. Diagnose your problems and challenges. So what are the where are you today? And in this case, let's say that you have an MSc and you want to pivot into deep learning research, and for some reason, getting a PhD is not an option. Well, your guiding policy, similar to the GROW model, I need to learn to read research papers and apply them. I need to show I can understand cutting edge research. I need to network with those hiring in this space. I need a mentor. And so now you could create an action plan, right? Well, learn to read research papers probably means learn to build deep neural networks using PyTorch. If you have a boss, if this is in a work environment, maybe ask my boss for help and advice. And of course, reach out to Vector. Vector is a great resource that everybody should be using all the time. So those are examples of strategies that you could take. And again, taking a step back, what I really, really recommend here is be realistic. Be honest with yourself about where you're at. I think things like double loop learning and SWOT analyses will help you be a little more honest and data driven. But then you're also going to have to say, okay, well, based on this, how do I guide myself? How do I address the obstacles that I have? And then ultimately keep yourself honest with your action plan. One thing, again, from a data-driven perspective, as you do this, let's say every quarter or every year, if you notice you're not meeting your action plan, you're not doing the things you said you would do, or you're not getting the results that you would have expected by doing those things, then that's a great place to maybe have a reality check. And so with that, I just want to spend a minute or two on pivoting. I'll just stop for a minute and breathe. I I hope you're not overwhelmed. I know there's a lot here. And again, this webinar is being recorded, and I am definitely happy to share these slides. The point here is not that you need to do all of this today and be ready for it all tomorrow. You don't need a 50-page business plan for yourself, right? What is really important here is to know that these tools exist, number one. Number two, you're not the first person to have a lot of these challenges. And number three, there's a lot of different opportunities out there. I still remember when I was finishing undergrad, and basically the world seemed like you're either going to be a software engineer or a salesperson. That's it. Like that's the universe of options. And it was so scary and frustrating. Well, look, there's so many cool jobs out there that are so unique and different as we go through our careers. So with that, how do you tell if things aren't going well, right? Number one, I mentioned already this important piece around create an action plan, and diagnose yourself. Do you do the things you commit to? Because look, if you create an action plan and you're not doing them, then obviously that's what's going wrong, right? You're not doing the things you said you would do. If you are doing the things you're doing and you're not getting the results you're getting, then there's probably maybe a disconnect between the activities, or maybe you're not doing a great job. Look, we all make mistakes. We all have weaknesses, right? So maybe you're committing to things that aren't quite right for you. The other thing that I will say here too, by the way, is trust your gut. It's often your gut is a great place to go. If you're feeling like something's wrong and you can't quite vocalize it or turn it into words, um, think about that a little bit, explore it, and maybe even embrace it. And that's really, really important. In terms of a checklist of things you might want to do, again, a lot of this is very people oriented, but it is important. Having networking, talking to people who are going through the same challenges. Make sure you have mentors or a peer group of some sort, whether that's a formal peer group at work or an informal one with a few friends. One thing that's coming up a lot more now that I see is personal advisory boards. So the idea here is like find 2 or 3 people that you don't work with day to day, but that you could come back to on a regular basis and have a conversation with. Coaching, of course, meetups and events. And by the way, when I say coaching, the one-on-one sessions that we run, I'm always happy to chat about this stuff with folks. But I know Vector has a lot of different resources and groups and communities where you can have these conversations, and simply reaching out to folks and saying, hey, I'm with Vector and I'd love to, or I'm a researcher at Vector, or I'm finishing my MSc and I'm curious about X or Y, or I'm not sure how to proceed. People are often very, very happy to help, especially when it's not transactional. When you message them and say, hey, I'm looking for a job, people might be a little nervous to reply. But if you're asking them about how can I follow in your footsteps, you've got the job I want in 5 years, people are often very excited to have those conversations. So I'll stop here for a minute and see what questions are coming up. And there's some really, really interesting ones. Some of these I'm going to save for the panel because they're nice and juicy. So one of the things is around job postings that are looking for years of experience. How do I How do I address that? This is a really good question. If you are starting out your career and you don't have years of experience, I would say number one, sometimes these are nice to haves. So just make sure that you don't, still apply for the role. Number two, this is where volunteering comes in. I find people sometimes take the years of experience very, very literally. They think, okay, I need 3 years of experience specifically working as a software engineer. Listen, if you've been contributing to LangChain, again, just because I mentioned them as an example, for a year as an open source contributor, and you know how what their standards are, you know how to submit code, you know how to use GitHub Actions, you've got the same experience as people who have been working more formally. So just remember, frame those experiences, do that volunteering, etc. In terms of consulting positions, so one question that's coming up is consulting positions. What are some of the skills and capabilities that are being looked for there? This is the one where it's really focused on communication and facilitation. I generally recommend 2 or 3 things that people do if they want to be more on that kind of consulting side of things. One is emphasize the ability to architect and facilitate. Number two is emphasize your actual skills. Like, do you understand AI? You still have to know it a little bit. And all of this can be done via a portfolio. And one thing that I actually recommend is having some sort of a video portfolio where you record yourself communicating, because the consultant needs to communicate with clients, right? And so if I see a 60-second video where you're communicating a deep technical concept and simplifying it, I know you're going to be a great consultant. If you simply tell me in your resume that I know how to communicate well with clients, I have to take your word for it.